I also want to say that we don't plan to have a big party for her 80th birthday, so I consider this to be the celebration of that 80th birthday. And I know we all want to send, as you have already by your applause when she was mentioned, our best wishes to her. I also want to express appreciation, particularly not only to Jim Schlesinger and Dimitri Simes, but all of those who have participated in and who have made this conference possible. We meet at a very challenging time in America's history. We meet at a time when we have been through 3 years of events that have changed the world. I refer, of course, to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, to our victory over aggression in the Gulf War. As a result of those events, we live in a new world. And the question now is, what should the leadership position of the United States be in that new world? Other participants in this conference and the various forums, some of which I will attend, and I hope all of you can attend, will address what the policy of the United States should be in this new world, ideally. I'm going to direct my remarks in this political year not just to what our policy should be, but what is possible politically. In that respect, incidentally, I should point out that if you followed political campaigns, it's rather standard practice for the candidate to get up and say, this is the most important election in history. I know I've said it a lot of times when I run. And of course, every campaign is very important to the candidate. In this case, it's very important to the nation. Now, over the past 44 years, I've had the opportunity to observe 12 presidential elections. I've been a candidate in 5 of them. And in that period of time, there has never been a campaign in those 44 years in which foreign policy was less discussed. And there's never been a time in which foreign policy was more important. Because whoever is president in the next 4 years will provide the leadership that will make the difference as to whether peace and freedom survive in the world. Since that is the case, then, it is vitally important that foreign policy be front and center in our considerations. We've been on a roller coaster ride as far as foreign policy is concerned. After the communist victory in Vietnam, the attitude of most Americans was that there was nothing we could do in foreign policy. And then after our victory in the Gulf War, the conventional wisdom that we could do anything. And then after the collapse of communism, particularly in the Soviet Union, the conventional wisdom was that there was nothing left to do. As a result of these events, we see developing a new isolationism in both of the political parties. The general theme which runs through the new isolationists is somewhat like this, that the United States no longer should play or can play a leadership role in the world. There are some who say we can't afford to. There are others who say it is not necessary for us to play that role. And there are still others who say that others should play that role. When we consider what they are saying, I would say that it sort of reminds me of a pickup band, a ragtime band. You have some are marching to different drummers. Some are singing off-key. But all of them have the same tune, the same theme. Come home, America. As a matter of fact, what we find is that even some of those who have been the strongest supporters of a strong foreign policy role for the United States now say it's time to turn our efforts inward. We can't afford it as far as foreign policy is concerned, and our domestic concerns are so great we should look inward. What they fail to realize, those who take that line, is that foreign and domestic policy are like Siamese twins. Neither can survive without the other. What they fail to realize is that the American people will not support a strong foreign policy unless we have a strong policy dealing with problems at home. And what they fail to realize is that as far as foreign policy is concerned, it has an impact on what we do at home. We can't be at peace in a world of wars, and we can't have a healthy American economy in a sick world economy. For example, we all can recall, I can at least, You've read about it. I lived through it, the Great Depression. It began as a recession in 1931, became a depression in 1932, in great part because the United States adopted a protectionist policy as far as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was concerned. So we leave that particular position. We come now to the fundamental question. Is it necessary for the United States to play a role in this new world since all of these events have occurred? And those who answer no begin with what I think is a false premise. It goes something like this. The Cold War is over and we have won it. It's time to come home. That's only half true. It is true that as far as the Cold War is concerned, the communists have lost it. It is not true, however, that the free world has won it. What we have to realize is that the Cold War was not the traditional war over territory by great powers. It was a war of ideas, the ideas of communism versus the ideas of freedom. We can see that war most clearly in Russia. In Russia, the place where the seeds of the idea of communism were first planted. The Russian people reaped the very bitter harvest from those seeds that had been planted. And as a result, the Russian people rejected communism. They rejected it because it didn't work. But now freedom is on trial. And if freedom does not work, the Russian people are not going to return to communism because it failed. But they will return, in my view, to what I would call a new despotism, in which they trade their freedom for security, and in which they in effect, provide for leadership and to put their future in the hands of those who are going to make sure that they can have the necessities of life and who make the promises, and then, of course, will have the opportunity to carry them out. This new despotism, which would be shorn of the dying faith, the baggage of the dying faith of communism, this new despotism, which would have the overtones of imperialist Russian activities which have been traditional in Russian history, that new despotism could be a far more dangerous threat to peace and freedom in the world, and particularly to peace, than was the old Soviet totalitarianism. And it is that, therefore, that we have to address today. So let us turn to Russia. And in turning to Russia, as I was saying to Dr. Brzezinski during lunch, that does not mean that I believe we should ignore what is happening in Ukraine and the other republics that have become independent in Eastern Europe and the rest. But I use Russia only as the prime example of the problem. What I say about Russia would apply to the others as well. As we look at Russia today, the question somebody asked me at the table was briefly this: is it going to work? Are they going to survive? Is freedom going to survive? And the answer is it's going to be a very close-run thing. It's going to be close-run because there are many minus factors at this time. Among them, as Dimitri Simes has pointed out in a recent article, corruption is rampant. Among them, we have the problem of ethnic quarrels. Among them, we have the problem of enormous suffering because of the changes that have been made economically by the attempt to build a free market society in Russia. And one of the major reasons that there is a serious question as to whether freedom can succeed in Russia is the lack of a management class. When I say the lack of a management class, that indicates why the Marshall Plan analogy will not work. Because when we look at Russia and when we compare the situation in Europe, and for that matter in Japan, at the end of World War II, 5 years of war did not destroy the management class in Western Europe or in Japan. 70 years of totalitarian communism did destroy the management class in Russia. And therefore you have to have a different approach than simply the Marshall Plan approach. Those are the negatives. There are some positive factors which we sometimes overlook. And one is that Russia is a very rich country, rich in resources and rich in its people. It's a highly industrialized society. The Russian people are a great people. They are a strong people. We have to realize that 95% of the Russian people are literate. We have to realize that on their workforce, 90% have the equivalent of a high school education. We have to recognize, too, that Russia produces some of the great scientists, the great engineers, particularly in military activities. Some people forget that the first man in space was not an American, it was a Russian. There's another factor on the plus side, which is often overlooked. Pushkin in the 19th century wrote that rebellions in Russia tend to be senseless and violent. What is particularly significant about the revolution that has occurred is that it was neither violent nor, of course, was it senseless. And this is to the great credit, we would have to say, to both Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The major factor on the plus side, however, is that Russia, the new Russia, has a strong leader. Now, there's a tendency to underestimate Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin. Some say that democratically that he simply isn't, that politically he isn't democratic enough. And others say that intellectually he's not smart enough, socially, that he's not smooth enough. I have seen many great leaders over the past 44 years. I would rate both Gorbachev and Yeltsin as political heavyweights. Both were born as peasants. Gorbachev became a man of the world. Yeltsin remained a man of the people. And Yeltsin, right now, must never forget that. As he moves onto the world scene, he must always remember that if he's going to change the world, he first has to change Russia. He has to change it from dictatorship to democracy. He has to change it from a command economy to a free market economy. And if he's going to be able to do that, he's going to need help. The question is, should we provide that help? Let's look at the positive factors as far as Yeltsin is concerned. Yeltsin has demonstrated his physical courage by standing on top of a bank and facing of a tank and facing down a gang of card-carrying killers who were trying, of course, to run a counter-Stalinist coup. We also find that Yeltsin, in addition to that, and this is even more important in my view, he has political courage. He risked his immense popularity by adopting policies which let the ruble float. They have enormous inflation. It's caused enormous hardship, and as a result, has brought his popularity down. But it was a necessary first step in moving from a command to a free market economy. He is one who, unlike Gorbachev, if you read Gorbachev's first column in the New York Times a few days ago, Yeltsin is one who has repudiated not just communism, but socialism as well. He is one, too, who has completely vetoed all of the foreign aid programs that he inherited from Gorbachev, which in the year 1990 took $15 billion from the Russian budget, which provided aid to a number of countries, including Cuba, which were antagonistic to the West and to the United States. And we all know that in the field of arms control, for example, he not only has matched what President Bush has courageously taken the initiative on, he has exceeded it. So what do we find? We find that Yeltsin is the most pro-Western leader in Russian history. Under those circumstances, then, he deserves our help. What does he need? He needs a number of things, just to tick off a few of them. He needs, for example, help from the IMF and other sources, and that will take billions of dollars to stabilize the ruble. He needs more open markets for the exports, which Russia would want to make, the new Russia, to the West and to other parts of the world. He needs, in addition to the help of the West insofar as humanitarian aid is concerned. And there needs to be, without question, one facility, a Western group, which would analyze all and assess all of the needs and then would develop a program for working out with private enterprise and with governments how they meet those needs. I won't go into further detail because the experts can fill you in on it. But to summarize, very briefly, it is important for us to recognize that Yeltsin is going to need very substantial economic aid from the West. not just the United States, I emphasize, but from the West. The New York Times, in its editorial today, estimated that the cost of the aid to cover some of these items that I have mentioned and others would be approximately $20 billion a year over a period of 5 years. That's a great deal of money. However, the London Financial Times, in its report yesterday, pointed out that $20 billion a year has to be compared with 20 times that much that the West spent even last year, before the collapse of communism, to defend against the Soviet communism. So under the circumstances, this puts it all in perspective. Now we come to the hard political questions. What does the United States do? How do we meet this problem, particularly when we are in the midst of a presidential campaign and in the middle of a recession? And the first argument that is made, and it's one that is well taken, is that the United States has carried this burden long enough. It's time for others to take it. That after World War II, we provided aid to our allies, of course, but also to our defeated enemies, and enabled them to recover from World War II. Now it's time, therefore, for those that we helped then to assume the burden for helping the Soviet Union, the other countries in the former Soviet Union, helping Russia, the other independent countries in the former Soviet Union and those in Eastern Europe, that it's time for the ones we helped recover from World War II, help them recover from the Cold War. They are right. The major burden for meeting the needs that Russia has and the other countries that need the help, that must be carried by the countries in Europe and in Japan that we helped after World War II. But the United States is the richest and strongest nation in the world, and we must provide the leadership. We cannot provide the leadership unless we have a seat at the table. To paraphrase Ben Stein in another context, you can't have a seat at the table unless you have chips to put in the pot. And we have to have enough chips to be a serious contender for that leadership role. Now we come to basically a fundamentally basic question in a campaign year. What's in it for us? What's in it for us to help the Russians, Ukraine, the other independent countries in the Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe? And the answer is that a great deal is in it for us. Charity, it is said, begins at home, and I agree. But aid to Russia, just speaking of Russia specifically, is not charity. We have to realize that if Yeltsin fails, the alternative is not going to be somebody better, it's going to be somebody infinitely worse. We have to realize that if Yeltsin fails, if freedom fails, the new despotism which will take its place will mean that the peace dividend is finished. We will have to rearm, and that's going to cost infinitely more than with the aid that would provide at the present time. It would also mean, if Yeltsin failed, if freedom fails in Russia, it means that the great wave of freedom that has been going all over the world in these recent 2 or 3 years, that it will begin to ebb, and that dictatorship, rather than democracy, will be the wave of the future. On the other hand, if freedom succeeds in Russia, let's see what it means. It means that Russia will be an example to others, particularly in China, particularly in the other communist countries, the remaining ones, and in the non-communist dictatorships around the world, an example for the others to follow, a powerful magnet drawing them to that. It would mean, too, that we have, with Russia succeeding, a totally new world, a new world in the sense that what it can mean to everybody, particularly to us in the United States as well. Just think, for 70 years, communist Russia has been trying to export communism around the world. If Yeltsin and the reforms succeed, democratic, free Russia will be exporting the goods and ideas of freedom around the world. And that means that in the years ahead, that will have an impact going far beyond Russia, far beyond Europe, all over the world. And economically speaking, it means that the new Russia, with all of the production that we'll be able to have with a free economy, will provide great markets for the products of the United States. That means billions of dollars in trade and potentially millions of jobs. It also means, if Yeltsin succeeds, if democracy survives, that our children and grandchildren will have removed the fear of the possible world nuclear war that now haunts them, because democracies do not begin wars. We come now, however, to another political question. And I understand that people are interested in politics these days. So, and the political question is this. All of the pollsters are telling their candidates, don't tackle foreign policy, and particularly not foreign aid, because foreign aid is poison as a political issue. They're wrong, and history proves it. In 1947, I recall vividly, as if it were yesterday, what Harry Truman did. Let me lay the foundation of what he did and why. In that year, Harry Truman's popularity in January of that year, 1947, was 35%. The Congress was overwhelmingly Republican. He had suffered an enormous defeat electing the 80th Congress in the previous November. And yet, I remember as if it were yesterday, Harry Truman, jaunty, some said a little cocky, coming down before a joint session of the Congress and asking for millions of dollars in aid to Greece and Turkey to prevent communist subversion and possibly communist aggression. It was a very tough vote for two very young and both, as history later indicated, rather ambitious young congressmen. The liberal Democrats in Jack Kennedy's Massachusetts district were against any military foreign aid. And the conservative Republicans in my California district were against all foreign aid. Under the circumstances, however, after considering it, we both voted for it. And a majority in the House and the Senate, in that Republican House and Senate, voted for that program. And that was the program which later was developed into the Marshall Plan and later into NATO, which not only contained communism, but bought the time that was essential for communism to fail, as it inevitably did fail last year, not only in the Soviet Union, as well as, of course, in Eastern Europe 3 years before. That was an indispensable act. The following year, Harry Truman, who had been 35% in January of 1947, won the election for president. What is more important, however, is that that action by a Democratic president supported by a Republican Congress providing aid to Greece and Turkey laid the foundation. It was the indispensable step toward containing communism and eventually providing the basis for the victory of freedom in Russia and in the Soviet Union. And then you have a situation at the present time where we have a Republican president with a Democratic Congress with the opportunity to take action which would provide aid to Russia and the other countries that we have mentioned here, which would assure the victory of freedom. That is the political issue, and that is the foreign policy issue as well. We have then a situation which can be summarized in this way. During the Cold War, the United States and the other nations were doing everything that we could to prevent the success of what were basically evil ideas. Now, we have to do what we can to assure the success of those ideas that are good. If, for example, the United States, the people of the United States, could so splendidly react as they did and support that program that I've referred to, which Harry Truman asked for 47 years ago, if they could do that, a program which had for its purpose preventing and defending against war, isn't it also now even a greater inspiration that the United States will join other nations in a program that will bring the blessings of peace? In other words, putting it simply, war brings out the worst and the best in men. Real peace can bring out and will bring out only the best. That is the question, then, that Americans must face today. Political Americans, all Americans. And I think we know what the answer should be. As we look then to the future, I think it is important for us to recognize that we have this great responsibility, but it's also a very great opportunity. Consider this: the 20th century will be remembered as a century of war. By our leadership at this time, we can help make the 21st century a century of peace and freedom. That is our challenge. In his Iron Curtain speech, Winston Churchill said, "America at this time stands at the pinnacle of world power. This is a solemn moment for the American democracy, because with primacy in power is joined an awesome accountability for the future." Despite what the pessimists say, despite what the negatives say, those words are as true today as they were when he spoke them exactly 45 years ago today. America today has that responsibility. And we say, why not someone else? And if America does not lead, who? The Japanese? The Chinese? The Russians? The Germans? They are the only nations in the world that have the potential economic and military power to lead in the next century. This is our moment of greatness. It's our moment of truth. We must seize this moment because we hold the future in our hands.